Good morning, gentlemen. I'm going to make another short video today. The bright and sunny weather outside, and I got a wonderful background of horses running in motion. I'm going to talk of horses running in motion in Ukraine. The battle in Ukraine is on. It's a wonderful battle. I like battles, but then there has to be a raison d'etre. Why should you have a battle? Why should you have a war? But there is a war in Ukraine. I've discussed so many times who started it, why it took place, so that's not going to be a subject today. I'm going to talk of what's going to happen now further. Now, there was a news item yesterday that the Russians have unleashed a barrage of missiles on Ukraine. Hundreds of missiles have been hitting Ukraine, and Ukraine's infrastructure is destroyed. Ukraine is going back 2 decades, 3 decades. 8 million refugees are floating around Europe, and Ukrainians suffering casualties, but the Ukrainians are holding on. Thanks to the Americans who are pumping in weapons, and as per my latest report, the good Patriot missiles are also coming to Ukraine. How much they will affect the war, that has to be seen to be believed. I don't think there will be much of an effect. But what happens next? All this barrage of missiles which are falling on Ukraine, are they going to bring victory for Russia? I don't think so. Now, if you remember the history of warfare written by Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, he had made one very significant statement which is valid now even in the present age, which we call the age of electronics and computer warfare. He said, whatever you do, you need the infantry soldier to hold the ground. Nothing wrong with it. I think it's a cardinal principle. How will you win a war if you do not have the infantry soldiers in that place to hold that area? Now, this is where the Russians have failed. They tried to take Kiev and Kharkiv. There was stiff resistance, and why? Because the Russian army morale was low. They hadn't fought a battle for a long time also, and so they withdrew. Putin thought he'd have an easy time in the Donbass region, which had a lot of pro-Soviet sentiments and people there, and so he mounted an offensive there, and some territory did capture. Probably he was foxed into a misconception by the ease with which he had taken over the Crimea. He had an idea that perhaps the same thing would happen in entire Ukraine, and if you remember, he treated this campaign as a limited military engagement, and his initial thrust, he passed a decree, requested that the Ukrainians should lay down their arms. I mean, he was being very foolish. Which country will tell its army to lay down their arms when they have a backing from countries like the United States, which is the number one power in the world? So this is where Vladimir Putin completely misread the situation. Now, that is a sad commentary on the aptitude of Mr. Putin. As I've said, he's not in the class of Stalin, who held the Soviet Empire and the Tsarist Empire together for 3 decades. So this man thought he'd going to win an easy victory, so it was like going for a walk in the drawing room. And by the time a couple of months had passed and he woke up to the fact, he started using missiles, this thing, that thing. But then the Russians have suffered so many casualties, at least 100 of their high-ranking officers have been shot dead in battle, and the Russian army's morale has tanked, and now he has started using these weapons and all, but they're not going to bring him victory. Because I said, whatever destruction the missiles bring around, he will need the army to move in, and that is the problem. The Russian army is not able to give the decisive punch to the Ukrainians. Well, I am not saying the Ukrainians winning, because they are also going nowhere, because they are obviously greatly hard pressed also. But then it's working out more like a stalemate, a war of attrition. And the question arises, what Russia is going to get out of by sending all these missiles every time? And how long are they going to continue? How long can you sustain it? After all, there always is a limit. And I do not know what is the Russian limit, but there is a limit, and they could very well get into a lot of problem in the time to come. I don't visualize this battle continuing for another 2 years. If it does continue, it could be something like what was going on between Iraq and Iran. You know, the battle lasted a couple of years and there were skirmishes on the border, they were fighting, killing 2 soldiers here, 2 there. It might continue like that. But then ultimately these 2 countries had to make peace, Iraq and Iran, and now the same thing they'll have to do in Ukraine also. So there has been serious miscalculations by the Russians, and if as a military historian you study this campaign, you must realize that no army can fight any war unless it is conditioned to fight. And I think the Russian army is not conditioned to fight, because the last war they fought but basically was in Afghanistan, where they got defeated, and I don't recollect they having won any major battles after that. They always had an easy passage, you taking over the Crimea or even going and helping Assad in Syria. These were easy options. At the crucial moments where they should have stood by their friend Saddam Hussein, they didn't do it. They should have stood by Libya's strongman Muammar Gaddafi, they didn't do it. At that time Russia was weak also, and they had to toe the American line. So those places were where they should have made a stand, they never did. And now they are in a big stand. They don't know how to win in Ukraine, and they are not going to win with the present policy. This is also a lesson to countries like China, who have not fought a war for the last almost 44 years. The last war, I think, was in 4 decades back against Vietnam, and they didn't do very well there. So the Chinese also must think twice before they think of invading Formosa. And they don't have the amphibious capability. They'll all be sitting ducks. Their landing craft will be just sunk, and thousands of soldiers just go in the Straits of Taiwan to the next world. So these are the points we must remember, and we must also recollect that Japan was able to carry out its invasion policy when it had the amphibious capability, the very strong navy, and that is how they went about it. Now the question arises, as far as Ukraine is concerned, what's going to happen? You need a crystal gazer to guess what's going to happen, because Putin now doesn't know what to do. I mean, this is my personal assessment. He's been sending out feelers to Ukraine to have a sort of a détente, a ceasefire, and then discuss things. But this ceasefire is not going to help out, because Ukraine is not accepting it, because it means giving a de facto recognition to the areas which have been captured by Russia. Ukraine can only agree for a ceasefire or a peace if the Russians agree to vacate the areas which they have captured, and they are insisting that even the Crimea should be handed back to them. The Crimea actually has been Russian territory since the dawn of history, as far as I remember, and tacitly Donald Trump had recognized the Russian interest in the Crimea. So that was a gift which Putin had, and he should have stuck to it instead of trying to take over the entire Ukraine. Because the scars of history are so deep among the people of the two nations, though they have the same culture, the same religion, the same race, but the Russians never treated the Ukrainians their equal, and we know what happened in 31-30. You don't have to repeat it here again. Mass famine, millions killed. So how can you forget all that? How do the Ukrainians forget it? Indians can forget, that's the best part of it. India had a famine in Bengal, induced again by the British. 2 million Indians died, but nobody mentioned about it. People have forgotten it. This is, ye to Bhagwan ki kripa hai. I mean, that's how the Indians go about it. The Ukrainians don't go and believe in that. Now the battle is at an interesting stage. And I think the Americans are also getting tired. The NATO countries are tired because their ammunition, their weaponry is getting depleted. And who's the gainer of all this is China, which in any case is also suffering a lot of internal dissension. We'll have to watch what's going to happen there later, but not concerned with this particular video. As far as this video is concerned, I feel the Russians are in for a hard time, and it looks like a fertile ground a last gamble that Putin may get induced an internal explosion in Russia, in Ukraine, and nuclear explosion. I think that is the only way this stalemate can end. We'll have to see what happens. Or maybe there could be a regime change in Russia also. One shouldn't be so sure that it's not going to happen, because I think the Russian people would also be getting exasperated with casualties, people getting killed, and the result being a big zero. Well, gentlemen, let's hope the war ends and sanity prevails. But the one lesson we have, that unless an army is motivated and can fight, you can't win. Secondly, the infantry soldier must hold the ground, and no amount of rockets and missiles are going to win you the battle. In both cases, the Russians are on the back foot. Let's see what happens, gentlemen. I close now. Goodbye and God bless. Subscribe to my channel. Share with your friends. Jai Hind. God bless. Take care.